So I'm Michelle,
Yeah.
and I'm here with Tegan from Cosmic Creeper. And that was weird and awkward, but we're going to roll with it because I don't want to do it again. And we're doing a new series called Tarot Beyond Tradition because we realized that neither one of us learned how to read tarot traditionally.
Yeah.
I think we're doing back and forth, right, on our two channels?
Yeah.
Is that our plan? Cool. That'll be fun. And we're going to talk all the non-traditional tarot goodness. Yeah.
Including asking questions, right?
Yes, including questions. So if y'all have any questions, put them in the as description box. That's not it. Put them in the comments. Put them in the comments. It's been a morning. None of my shit has worked this morning. We've had issues. If you have questions for us about tarot beyond tradition, so reading tarot beyond tradition or working with tarot outside of the traditional framework, I would say, practices other than divination. I think that's also kind of beyond the traditional idea of what tarot is.
And possibly
so if you have any questions,
non-traditional decks as well, I guess, and people might
have
some questions about.
Yeah, that would be fun. So maybe we should start off by defining what tradition is so we can understand the context of what we're saying is non-traditional, right?
Yeah.
So how are you defining what traditional tarot is?
As far as you can define, because I feel like that's a thing in itself. I would consider traditional tarot to be something that falls into I often end up calling it schools of thought, but that's the therapist's brain. So what do we call them? Like approaches, I guess, which fall into predominantly Marseille, Rider-Waite-Smith, and Thoth. I wouldn't even say Pippish numerological reading feels as traditional to me. I feel like it's just those three schools of thought in tarot. Obviously, you've got the cartomancy.
Yeah.
So that
well, and then there's this kind of just Golden Dawn versus
true.
Because Thoth and RWS both kind of came out of that tradition.
Yeah, and split.
Yeah.
So 4 in total-ish?
Yeah, 4-ish. Yeah, I don't consider pips or numerological very traditional either, because I feel like that's branching off of everything else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would consider anything that has that is kind of steeped in a particular way of thinking and being is how I would define it.
And it's very structurally founded, and it becomes tradition because people have continued to and I mean this not in a horrible way, but rinse and repeat and follow the structure again and again and again. And that sort of it becomes traditional over time because, of course, when it pops up, it wasn't traditional, it was new.
It was new, yeah. Now we call it traditional, yeah. Also, I think that traditional for me is there's a body of work to support it.
Yeah.
Because you can get RWS books, you can get Thoth books, you can get Marseille books or video. It doesn't even have to be books nowadays, videos and podcasts and things like that. Those all, in my opinion, kind of contribute to cultivating this idea of what tarot looks like from a traditional standpoint. And when we say traditional tarot, we don't mean that in any sort of a disparaging way. It's just it could be kind of taken in that context, I think, for some people, but that's definitely not how we mean it. It's not like it's a bad thing to read tarot traditionally.
No, I think it's not anti.
It's not anti-tradition, yes. We're just going to discuss some of the different ways and thoughts and practices around stepping beyond that. So stepping outside of that. I see it as kind of like a growth opportunity.
Yeah, it's very developmental, and it's sort of retaining that elasticity and evolution. And I think one of the key parts for me, which is something that I wrote in my notes in case my brain malfunctions at some point throughout this, that it's, in some senses, you could argue that this either was a person's or a group of people's personal gnosis at one point, and then it's not about disrespecting tradition. It's about understanding how it's birthed and realizing that we can be a living, breathing part of that process. and that's sort of how they evolve and new forms get branched off. So when people say, oh, but someone just made that up, like that system, I'm like, yeah, that's
someone made everything up.
They all came into existence, and then some of them got agreed upon, some of them didn't. Sometimes they have backing for various reasons and others not. Of course, experiential backing, you know, if it works, then yay. If it doesn't, why bother? So
yeah, I kind of look at it as tarot in is learning like a language, and then what you do with that language. So it's learning the basics, learning the traditions is kind of like learning your alphabet, so that you can then take those letters and put them together and make your own words. It doesn't discount what the letters are and what they mean. You're just rearranging them in your own way to make your own stories.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I look at the difference between like tarot versus traditional tarot versus non-traditional tarot. We're just taking it and adding your own layer to it, which, like you were talking about, is the same thing they did, right? So if you even look at like RWS and Thoth, those both came out of the Golden Dawn tradition, and then they took that and they added their own layer over it. Because wasn't it like that was part of their initiation, right? It was to create a tarot deck. So all of their initiates had their own version of tarot. I'm frozen again.
Okay, you're back.
I'm back. I apologize for the issues. Like it's either dark or I'm frozen, and there's like we've been round and round trying to fix it.
Yeah, we tried, and this is how we're receiving Dawn today.
This is how I'm doing. I'm in my shadow mode. This is what we're doing. It's not like it's dark here. It's 10:30 in the morning and the sun is out. So I don't know what my camera's problem is.
You're seeing like false environments here, because yours looks like, I mean, it's 6:30 here now, and it's getting darkish, and for some reason it's really bright at the moment.
It's really bright.
Do you want to move into how you would define non-traditional tarot for yourself?
Yeah, let's talk about non-traditional tarot. I think for me, non-traditional tarot is anything that steps outside of the norm, what is communally understood to be a way of working with, or a card interpretation or an image or things like that. Stepping outside of that in any way, shape, or form, I feel like is non-traditional. How about you?
I definitely, I think, because I don't want to repeat what you're saying, so I very much agree with that. And I feel like the way that I often describe, without getting too like witchy or out there for people, in terms of like the spirit of something that people co-create, I feel like it is a living, breathing thing. And so for me, it's not necessarily, which I'm sure what you're saying as well, it's like an expansion upon, outside of, beyond, a stretching, something that's not refined by what sometimes can be a rigidity of the structure. So it's not void of tradition for me, in terms of we're both informed by tradition. So I think that's a key facet as well, but it's just not defined solely by that. And I think in that sense, it means that it evolves as well. So it's sort of beyond, isn't it? Like you say, and making it your own, tailoring it, stretching it, adding new facets. Like I think that even what's considered tarot now is quite modern in comparison to what was incorporated in traditional tarot originally, because there's a lot more facets that have been communally accepted in tarot that people wouldn't have included years ago. Like more psychotherapeutic aspects of it that just wouldn't, that wasn't as much of a thing. So yeah, the same as you really. It's just anything that goes beyond that, and also the blending of it. But I feel like that comes into how we then do non-traditional tarot. So I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but yeah. Essentially what you said.
It's just like, I feel like it's taking the building blocks of what we learn and adding and expanding into how we work with it on a personal level.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, I'm not a professional tarot reader, as in I don't read for others, but I think even that probably, it probably plays into that too. Because if you're reading for others, you're still reading through your lens, and everything that you've learned and that you bring into your work with the cards. So it's kind of taking that that base layer. And I think that's why I wanted to be like real clear about, we're not saying traditional tarot is bad, because it is actually the building blocks of a lot of what we do. Other than you and I both did learn outside of,
Yeah.
so like, let me
We
just
learned traditional
later. We learned traditional later. Yeah. So, and I think that has definitely informed the way that I work with the cards, because I never really saw them originally as being really set in a box.
Yeah, same.
So it wasn't like, the Three of Swords always means this. That's not how I was taught to read tarot. And I wasn't really taught that it meant anything in particular. It was like, here's the bones of it, and then you take the context of the reading, and that's what it means. So when I first came into reading like some traditional tarot books, and like to discover that heartbreak was a common keyword used with the Three of Swords, that just blew my mind. I was like, why?
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. Tell me how a growth number mixed with an air mind suit gets you heartbreak. I mean, I can see it now, and that's the thing, you can justify any meaning for any card,
Of
right?
course, yeah.
But it didn't make sense to me, because it was so locked into a particular way of seeing the card. And
you
that's
were
not how I
very
learned.
neurologically developed, right? From
Yeah.
sort of like initiation, as it were.
Yeah.
I know that makes it sound more formal than it was.
It does.
I would say that one of the things that is probably, and I don't think hot topic's the right term, and I hope not, because I hate hot topics. I like to be uninvolved with those.
Yeah.
But perhaps is the mildest version of controversial ever, is that I believe that, and this is just the way that I work with stuff in that sort of non-traditional capacity, is that if I'm picking a deck, I feel like the artwork is then important, and that the visual is a part of a leading factor. But I also believe at the same time that I could work with someone with a pictureless deck and still read tarot, and I could do both of those in the way that I read, and the things that I pulled upon would perhaps, it's almost like, if you think about percentages, like they obviously wouldn't be visually led then, but there would still be so many of the same facets that crossed over into both of those. And I think it's interesting, because people often speak about them as if they're at odds. And I definitely believe that both can be true. Like, I could read, if I literally just wrote the names on a bit of paper and pulled them out, and I would still utilize all those other facets that are part of how I read tarot. But if I'm using a deck, I'm definitely leaning into the imagery. And so that's why the way that I read in itself, I think, is non-traditional, because the ebbs and flows of how much it's tailored and intricative is reflective of the style that I read, all the things that I pull upon, and who I'm working with as well. So I feel like even that, because obviously I do read for people, I don't feel like everyone gets the same me in a reading, but they don't inherently get the same style and structure, verbatim. And not because I'm all over the place, but just because that's how I would work with clients as well. Like, it's that facilitating how you're working, what's brought to it, what you're discussing, what deck you're using. So I feel like that's an extension of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like that the way that we work with this sort of tradition versus non-tradition, I don't feel like it's really that clear cut of a line.
No.
Like, sometimes, because sometimes it's a very rare occasion, but sometimes the Three of Swords will hit the thing, and I'm like, oh yeah, in this context, okay, so like actually heartbreak kind of applies, because it's so contextual. Like it's that, and that's the thing that I've always struggled with the having very traditional set meanings for cards, is that it's so dependent on what the question is, what the context of the reading is. If you're using spread positions, that adds a whole nother layer to it. And I think that sometimes we forget to really talk about or give credit to all the other elements that come into play when we're looking at a card. You can't just say a 3 of swords means this in every situation, because if I apply a spread position to it, it's going to mean something different. If I ask one question versus another, it's going to mean something different. And I think that's the hard conversation to have, though, because it is so dependent on what's going on. So like, how do you even talk about that? But that's, I think, just stepping outside of this card means this is, I feel like personally, if you step outside of that, you're dipping your toes into non-traditional.
Yeah.
Because to me, traditional is very, very like, this is what it means. And then I'm going to move beyond that.
Yeah. And they're too finite for me, which I feel like is what you're saying. And it's not that, I mean, arguably someone could read tarot and it could mean anything for any card, and that's their way of reading. And I don't feel like that's where we sit either, but I definitely find it boxed in. And one of the reasons I said to people, I don't read reversals, again, in the traditional fashion. So I don't even bother, like if a card's reversed, I spin it around. The way that I read blockages and the multifaceted context of them, again, is very dependent on spread and querent and question on myself and stuff like that. But I feel like it's very important to have I can't think of a better word for it. So like a stretchy capacity with tarot. And this is something that comes up a lot. I'm sure it probably does in your it's not a Patreon, it's your members for your YouTube. Like certainly my Patreon, or even when people have spoken to me on Instagram, you know, oh, well, I did one of these spreads and like that you've done, and your spread position says, what's one of my, I don't know, superpowers? That's not commonly my language, but what's my superpower? And I get the 3 of swords. And people then really struggle with that contextually, because if say they only have a Rider-Waite-Smith meaning of it, they're like, well, why is heartbreak my superpower? And it's so rigid. And I think that perhaps traditional tarot would feel a little bit less rigid to me if more people wrote about it in that, adding their layers of it. But a lot of the time, not perhaps in the singular books, but in the guidebooks, there isn't a space for that.
It's interesting too when you're looking at coming in from a beginner, and you didn't learn to read traditionally either. So I feel like the way I learned to read was actually easier than when I tried to learn the RWS.
Oh yeah, learning the right way was really stressful. And I know that that's not like, people will be like, oh, maybe you were doing it wrong. I mean, I was doing it wrong because I was doing it with the Wild Unknown as well.
Nothing like making it extra hard.
Yeah, but I also then eventually got the what's it called, the Mystical Cats Tarot, which is why I've kept it, firstly because it's cats, and secondly it's just sheer nostalgia.
Right? Yeah,
it's a lot easier to do that with, but it was stressful because it's like almost trying to not story read and not. And when I say story read, like I've said this to people a lot, so hopefully it's not too boring, but I've always read artwork, and I think a lot of us do it without realizing. And you don't have to have been an art student, but I was an art student, and I got brought up around artists as well as therapists. I was very lucky. I had a plethora of people around me, and so when we used to go to museums, it was very much like, look at this piece and tell me what you think's going on, or how does it make you feel?
Yeah.
Or, you know, give the characters voices, or what color do you notice first? Any of the many things that we've spoken about. And learning Rider-Waite-Smith was like, stop doing that, because this is it. And like you said, it's like an alphabet thing. And when you come to stuff like that later in life, in my experience, it's like learning another language.
It's like learning another language. Yeah, it's difficult when you're older.
It's difficult and it's confusing and it's completely possible, but I don't feel like it wasn't like a duck to water kind of thing. It was very much I would do monthly challenges because I just had to pull a card every day and Rider-Waite-Smith it and Rider-Waite-Smith it.
Yeah.
It was and I feel like potentially we must have had a similar experience but different difficulties, because obviously you had the numerology. I didn't have that, but I certainly had, like I said, one of my 2 decks, my first decks was the Medicine Woman Tarot, and whilst it has Rider-Waite-Smith infusions, it's certainly so far from being anything mildly clonish, and that's not what the Three of Swords, to use that nice that nice Rider-Waite-Smith one.
Yeah.
That's not what it looks like. That's not the vibe that it gives you. And it's not what the book says either, if you fall back onto that. So it's like, yeah, it was an interesting experience coming to it later.
Yeah. I was so confused because I came from the numerological elemental, which is a very set structure. It's funny because when I talk about tradition and structure and all of that, I'm actually coming from a very set structure of how I read tarot. It's just really broad. It's really, really broad. So like 3s are like their growth numbers, which is like that Empress energy.
Yeah, and it's like
so
the first initiation into creation, isn't it? The 3,
right? Yeah,
like
the 3. Yeah,
concept, the expansion of the concept with something else to try and found it, and then something happens.
Yeah, when you put the triangle together too, that's like, I love that little visual because it's like that, it creates that portal. Like I love 3s. They're like a portal energy. It's the portal, the step into the next thing. And then you just apply the elemental association depending on what suit you're in. So if you're in cups, it's, emotional. If you're in swords, it's mind. And so you take that, it boils down to, like, I can give you a, 2-word keyword for every single card, because it boils down to the 3 of Swords is growth of the mind. And that's how I was taught to read, because the whole point was then you can read with any deck. So that's my baseline, is my numerological elemental. And then I can layer in the interpretations and traditions and things like that from the deck itself that I'm working with. So if it's an RWS, or even if it's a non-traditional and the author has their own way of working with the cards, I can layer that in. And then my own, because to me, as reading for myself, that's the most important layer. Yeah. It does not matter what Waite thought of the 3 of Swords in my life. It does not matter one hill of beans what that man thought. What matters is what I think about it when it comes up for me in a reading, particularly when I'm using it to like work through something or navigate something or understand something. So like, I don't give a crap what Waite thought. I need to know what I think, because that doesn't help me any. What helps me is what I can do with it today, because he's not me.
Well, and also just as well, really, because firstly, he would be horrendously out of date now and amazingly politically incorrect. And I think the thing is as well, like, that's why if people were more flexible with tradition, then I don't think it would be so much of a tradition versus non-traditional, which is, like I said, not what we're trying to say, but I think how some people experience it is it's either or, whereas for us it's more just, you're moving in and out in a more of a fluid capacity. It's like a blending and a meeting of them. And the reason I feel like, and obviously it's just my belief, and everyone can read tarot how they want, like it's like you said, you're not Waite, so
right.
But I think with this, if we were to follow the structures and the traditions in such a rigid capacity, then we wouldn't have great books coming out like Radical Tarot and, Decolonizing Tarot, and all of the things that actually are really hopefully reflective of our communities and necessary and involve more people and are more reflective of the human race across the board. Whereas if we just stuck to that tradition, I feel like that's where some of the pitfalls come in. And it's not that non-traditional is void of pitfalls, because like you said, it's always from our lens. And that's what I say to people. That's why I won't get into the topic too much, because it's probably a topic for another time. But I don't believe that you can give an unbiased tarot reading. Now, I'm not saying that you can have less bias, but I think, and I would align it with a therapy practice, we are taught to be aware and notice our judgments and do something differently with them so that we don't act upon them. But it doesn't mean that you never have any judgments and that you become suddenly inhuman.
Right.
I feel like it's the same with a tarot reading. I don't believe that a tarot reading is unbiased any more than I believe that you can completely give unconditional love, because humans are conditional. We can give less conditions, but we're kind of conditional by nature. So I find some of the language, without getting into that, really interesting in itself. I won't go on more of a tangent.
No, that's fine. That's the whole point, right? That was the whole point of this thing. Go off on tangents and talk about all the things, because these are the things that I think don't get talked about very often, because it could be considered controversial. And as we've stated, we will, disclaimer this video, we are not shitting on anyone's tradition. That's not the point.
No, we're not yucking yums either.
Yeah. We're just trying to have an open and honest discussion about the different approaches to tarot. And we are seeing more stuff come out that I think approaches the idea of non-traditional tarot, or really tarot stepping outside of the Golden Dawn, which I feel like, because that is such the foundational block from which most of what we get today in terms of decks and books and everything is all coming out of that. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but I think it's great that we're now allowing room for things to expand and to grow. So I think there's room for, as you learn more and as you grow more, for you to take that traditional foundational block and expand upon that.
Yeah, for sure. Because even in some of my, like a lot of my Rider-Waite-Smith decks, and I maybe it's because I don't have many that do just the pierced heart, but even that, I can't not think about communication and narrative and the layers of it. And usually the deck depiction, arguably, it can express communicative turmoil and turmoil of how we're thinking and talking to ourselves or communicating with others without it inherently being heartbreak, and that still fits with the imagery. It's not dishonoring or ignoring it, it's incorporating it, but it's more, like you said, it's just it's influenced enough by it without it sort of breaking me into an unnatural stance, as it were.
Yeah. It's the difference between, we're looking at things and letting it inform your opinion versus be your opinion. That's two very different things. How many of us are actually traditional tarot readers anymore? Like, I know people who read the RWS fairly closely in alignment with it, but they still, in one way or another, step outside of that, whether it's to add this layer or to that layer or whatever. So I'm kind of curious as to, like, if anybody, like, does anybody consider themselves a traditional tarot reader anymore in that sense, like in our community?
And then if so, what does it mean for you? Because I don't think there's a right and a wrong answer. And whilst we seem to be pretty in agreement with what traditional and non-traditional feels like for us in our practice, it could be very, very different for someone else.
Yeah. So, like, if you're watching and you have thoughts, definitely leave them in the comments, because, like, we are generally interested in knowing what other people think about what tradition is. Like, what does that mean to you, and how far outside of tradition do you step in how you read? I feel like I step pretty far outside of what the RWS is considered, but I stick to kind of like my own tradition. But when it comes to my practices, like the things I do with my decks, I'm way out far of tradition, I think. Like, and I think you're probably outside of tradition too. Like, reading cards for divination is a very small part of my tarot practice.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that layer. I'd completely forgotten, but actually that's a really good point as well, because yeah, we do a lot of other stuff with our cards, like a lot of other stuff between the two of us, and the divination portion of it is, yeah.
So, like, what are the things that you do in your practice that you would consider, like, if we're saying that using tarot for divination is kind of the tradition, so what do you do in your practice that steps outside of that, working with your cards?
Oh, where to start?
Like, let's give people some ideas, stuff we do.
Well, firstly, I think when cards inspire anything, although you could argue someone could be inspired by the card from the traditional meaning realm, but inspiring things like art creations, poetry, what other writing pieces, things like that. But yeah, without going into too many things, like I've got clients, and I don't just necessarily mean tarot reading clients, I mean like clients in therapy world that are have expressed an interest in visual and stuff like I don't just start throwing tarot down everyone's neck. Actually, I'm very, very careful of anyone who might express an interest in stuff like that to make sure, but pulling cards and intuitively reading a story across it, and sort of having a lot of the card work I do with people actually in therapy is very somatic based as well. And I think that in itself is like I'm not saying that people who read traditionally don't ask clients how they think and feel, but it's not, it's so inherently not about the set box meaning of it by that stage. It has absolutely sweet F all to do with it. It's like, what does this color mean to you? What does this evoke? Or go through the cards and tell me what it is that jumps out at you and why. Why is that? And it becomes like a conversational visual aid to topics that we're already discussing. And at that stage, you're not really doing a reading in any capacity that would be perceived as traditional. The cards are there as an additional tool in the same way. And if anyone's familiar with other therapy stuff, you have sandbox stuff, you have toy animals is one of my favorites. There's a lot of like play and art therapy stuff that people that are that way inclined get trained in, and you pick animals to like represent different family members and stuff, and then where you place you'll have probably seen I've adapted a lot of that stuff and taught people how to do it with tarot. So I think some of those things are probably really out of the box, but I think some of yours are probably even more so out of the box.
Yeah. Well, I use mine for, like, more of the typical things, which would probably be still considered non-traditional, but like journaling, path working, visualization, things like that. Those are a little bit, they're like box adjacent, I think.
Yeah, like
they're box adjacent. Yeah. But then, like,
popular as well.
Yeah, it's quite popular. But then, like, I've got like my whole the dice thing that I do, that I add that layer in. I use cards when I'm gaming. That's a very different thing. I have decks for different characters, so when I'm playing different games with different characters, they each have their own deck, and I will do readings around that. It is a way of like adding play into the work with tarot, but it's also always like practice. So I get a lot of questions, I don't know if you get this too, about like, well, I get tired of doing the same thing over and over again. Well, yeah, I mean, like pulling a daily card? Okay, I've done the daily draws on and off for decades.
Yeah,
that shit is boring. Right? It just does. Like, it just does. So finding other ways to add tarot into other things that you do. But again, that's stepping way outside of tradition. And it doesn't discount the work that that happens with the tarot, because even when I'm like in a game and I'm pulling cards for a character, I'm still looking at that through my lens, and there's always a message that comes through for me, even though I'm working with it with my character in a video game. It's all play and it's all for fun, but it's also me practicing my skills, and I get a message every time, and it's a legitimate message. It's like the same of when I do videos, and I'm like, I will forever like go down saying I don't do sample readings because I am incapable of it.
Yeah.
I can't do a, like, let's, when you're showing a deck or whatever, like, let's do a pretend 3-card reading. That shit ain't pretend. It throws my dirty laundry out every time. And it's like, fine, that's fine. But I am incapable of doing sample readings, play readings, pretend readings in that way. Even when I'm playing with my cards, there's real stuff coming through that for me. So I think play over the years has become a huge part of my tarot practice. But like underneath it all, I feel like we all create our own little unique traditions.
Yes. And that's why I've started calling my tarot reading style intricative as well, because it's non-traditional to be able to fluidly move from Golden Dawn influences into purely numerological and elemental or color-based influences. That in itself, it becomes like this whole package. And what we put in that, for me, as time develops on, it inherently becomes something that we have added to and expanded upon. And yeah, if everyone else adhered to it, then we would make a new tradition, like a new, 2.0 of whatever it was.
Right.
But that's not necessarily what's happening. And so
Yeah.
it's all of those infusions, whether, like you were saying, like whether it's the gaming or whether it's spirit work or whether it's the therapeutic stuff I put in there, it all just makes it something that isn't quite traditional anymore, because it's not sitting just in that realm. And I feel like, I think I said at the beginning about personal gnosis, I feel like that's how we add our stamp on it, though. That to me, it just makes sense. It's a natural progression of that, in the same way that the way that I work with color isn't a way in which you could open a book and be like, this is what the colors mean. Because even that, I might have what I would call common associations, but which is definitely influenced, and I think it happens the same with tarot. We get influenced by media or what we read or what we see and stuff like that. They're definitely influences, but I don't have one association per color. So even that, like if I tried to write it for someone else, I don't think they'd love it as a tradition, because it would be like, well, how comes red sometimes means anger, but sometimes it means that sensual and powerful and empowered? Like, how do I know which?
Right. Rich is rich. Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know how to explain how someone else would feel what I'm feeling to be able to know. It's just an intuitive thing.
Yeah. That's that whole idea of trying to distill this non-traditional way of approaching tarot in a very fluid and personal kind of way. The idea of trying to distill that down into a book, like, because that's been something I've been working on for like ever, like maybe someday, who knows, but it's a hard thing, because the whole point of it is to not say this means this. It's like, this means this unless this, or unless that, or maybe over here because this over here. And like, just your brain, it's like a mind map, not a linear outline. Maybe the idea of reading in a traditional way isn't even really so much a thing anymore. And I love that we have space for that kind of thing to come through. It's everything that I do is based in my own traditions. Like you're saying, personal gnosis. That's what it is for me. That's the whole point of tarot. I'll be honest, if I didn't read from my own personal gnosis, tarot would be meaningless to me. It'd be useless. It
would
really
be like
would.
trying to put on someone else's clothes and go and do their job for the day or the week.
Yeah.
Like, okay, maybe it would be fun for a bit, depending.
It might be fun for a bit, but yeah, like that. And that was part of my, I think, why that's how I kind of ended up on YouTube. That's kind of how I ended up here, is because I wanted to see, were there other people that did that too?
Yeah.
Like, how do you experience your decks? What do you see when you look at that card? Like, I just don't read for me from the guidebook. I mean, like, that's great. Like, to know if you're, I shouldn't say that because that sounds terrible, but like if you're doing a walkthrough and you're like, this is what the author said about that. Cool. That's great. If I'm looking at possibly buying that deck, that's helpful to know. But I also want to know what you think.
Yeah.
What do you see when you look at that card? Like, if I want to know what the author thinks, I will buy the deck and read the book. I want to know what you think if you're looking at it. And that's kind of how I ended up here, was looking for that facet of non-traditional tarot, because all I had previous to that was the books that I had access to. And I was doing the daily draws and all that, and I was so bored. and trying to read, and that was one of the things that I realized early on when I was doing my RWS studies, was like, if I had learned to read this way, I don't know that I would still be using tarot. I'll be perfectly honest, because I am the type of person that if you tell me the structure, I'm going to go, that's cool. I hear what you're saying. I'm going to go over here and do my own thing. So if somebody had brought me the RWS and been like, this is the structure, this is the way you read it, I probably have been like, that's cool. And I probably would not still be doing it here today, if I'm being honest, because that's not how I function. Like, I need to take it. Yeah, I need to take it, and I need to I take all of this that I've learned. So I love study. I want to know what everyone else thinks and feels, but like at the end of the day, I'm going to pick and choose what works for me and what doesn't. And like, I'm real big about saying that with the content I create too. Like, this is my opinion. Nobody asked, but here it is. So take it or leave it. Take what works for you, leave the rest. Yeah. And that is perfectly okay and acceptable. And that is how I approached it. Because if I had only ever had that access of just, this is how you read it, I would not be doing it today. I know myself, I wouldn't. Because the minute somebody puts a rule or a structure on something, I'm like, nope, I'm over here doing it this way. Like, don't tell me I can't do tarot and D&D, right? Watch me make a whole thing out of that.
And I think it's really interesting, because I appreciate for some it might feel like semantics, and then there'll be like, of course, people flavor their own traditional readings, and that one of the reasons we want your questions and to hear from you is because what traditional means to you might be different in any way. But also, I do feel like you were saying, inherently to me, anything being intricative completely moves away from it being traditional, because traditional is not the fusion of it and something else. And so by fusing those things, but I feel like that's a real benefit for us as a tarot community, because we don't all have the same flavors, tastes, life experiences. And in the same, I feel like it's really important for everyone, including myself, to remember as well, like, not all tarot readers are made the same. Not all, what's another good example? Because I feel like I'm always then doing the therapy, but trust me, not all therapists agree either.
Right.
Like, just in case people needed to know that we don't all agree and think and function in the same capacity. Some of us definitely don't agree with certain theories or methods or approaches, but also like even health professionals. How many times have you been to a health professional and been like, you're just not getting it, and then you go to another one and they say something completely different, and they're in the same niche, like you might be going to see them about a very specific thing. And so I feel like that we're very lucky in that sense, because by not being in such a purist, rigid way, whether you follow tradition mostly or you don't, it allows us to see ourselves reflected in something. And not just for reading for ourselves, but if you're going to someone as well, then you can actually find someone who is somewhere reflective of how you want to receive a reading and what you think and feel of tarot, as opposed to, again, having to jump into a tiny box to be able to experience something, which, like you said, if you'd have had to do that, you'd have probably got bored of it.
Yeah. Oh, I would have absolutely I'd been out a long time ago. Like, my husband always says the best way to get me to do something is to tell me
not to do it,
I can't do it, or not to do it, or how to do it, and then I'll find a different way to do it. So, like,
excellent.
That's how we function around here.
I have a partner like that.
Yeah. And he's very much the opposite, where he's like, He just needs a list. Tell him how to do it. Get it done. Like, he was making jokes about, do you ever play the Lemmings game? Or
no, I haven't. I feel like I'm familiar with it though.
Or Warcraft. There's like anywhere where you had like little minions, where you have your little minions that go do something.
Right, yeah.
Like he's always making jokes that he's my little minion because I'm over here like all this crazy stuff. And
so like, yeah,
give me a list.
Have someone in, like, if you're a hunter in WoW, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. He's like, I'm just a little, I'm a lemming, and you tell me what to do and I will do it. Dig hole, I will dig hole.
Yeah.
Move box, I will move box. Like me,
I find that really relatable, which is why I said it took me a longer time to be able to reconcile, and it really is my training. That's why I always harp on about it, not because I'm completely obsessed with it, but obviously it makes sense, but it also helped me as a person because I'm very like that as well. Like, if you tell me what to do and I do it, awesome. I like to know where I stand. I like the list. I like this, but I also realize that the human condition isn't like that, and in a way of trying to stretch myself out of that, it's very much showed up in what I've trained in, and then I try and bring it to tarot for that exact reason. Yeah, because I actually think that makes it easier in some senses, especially because, like you were saying, then you can read the 3 a zillion ways, whereas if we return to, even if the 3 meant something great and you pulled it and said, like, where's really hurting me now, people struggle to frame that when it's so specific, and I think just some of it is just so specific.
It really is. I do love, though, like, I love guidebooks. So even though I'm like, you tell me to do it this way, and then, okay, I'm going to go do something different. But I want to know, like, what your thought process was, what your intention was. So every time I get a deck, I read the guidebook.
Same.
That does not mean I will read it that way, because now it's my deck and I will read it according to my own way of being in the world, basically. But I love learning about how other people see and perceive things, because that does influence some of the things that I think and see, because it's one of the reasons why, like, I like walkthroughs where people talk about what they see in the card, because if you are talking about a card, I look at it and see one thing, and then you say, oh, now you see this in it, and I look at it again through that perspective. So now maybe I see that, and that might be something I adopt, and it may be something I don't. But if you're just like so honed into it just means this one thing for this card, there's no space for that.
Yeah, it's like an echo chamber at that point, isn't it? And I agree. That's what I love about it. I might not agree, or I might not see it, or I might not adopt it. But certainly one of the reasons why I read so many of them, unless if I start reading a book and it is just Rider-Waite-Smith and it's not discussing the intent, the imagery, I piece out really quickly. Yeah. But otherwise, because sometimes people really do stretch my understanding of the tarot, and I'm like, that's the same reason I do tarot courses still sometimes, because I'm like, oh, awesome, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it becomes a part of your toolkit. And I try and shout those people out occasionally as well and stuff, but I think we're constantly being influenced by stuff like that if we're open to it. And the idea of an echo chamber just makes me feel twitchy, if I'm honest, anyway. Like, no.
Yeah. Well, it's like that whole thing. I got a not nice comment, and I was in a snarky mood, so I said not nice things back. But there was a comment about how sometimes it happens. There was a comment about how we all get a deck, and then we all talk about the deck, and we all show the deck, and like, as in, like, it's a bad, and that the person went on a different tangent. But that got me thinking about how, like, yeah, we do all get a deck and we will all talk about the deck. But that to me is really fascinating, because now it's a deck I've talked about, and now I get to see 5 other people talk about it and share their interpretation of it, which might be slightly different than mine, and the decks they use with it, or the practices that they're going to use it for. There are things that, like, I would have never thought to do that, but now I'm going to give it a try, right, and see how it works for me, and it may or may not. But I love that open space that we have to share all of that. And really, social media, for better or worse, it's got its pitfalls, we all know, but that is one benefit of it, is it really creates a beautiful space for discussing all the different ways to work with this type of a tool, really,
Yeah.
and a practice in different ways that would be considered non-traditional. Even the fact of just talking about it is considered non-traditional, because back in the day it was a closed secret, right? You didn't talk about it. So like from that perspective, even just talking about tarot is kind of a non-traditional thing to do. So
Yeah.
which is cool.
And I love what you were saying about, like, I watch reviews of decks I own. I have to obviously feel like it, and also, you know, I have my favorite people that I watch. And
Yeah, the same.
I love that, because again, even if I don't adopt it, it's just fascinating to me. And the whole, this is why I've said to people, I really don't care if you hate a deck that I love, and I don't mean that in a snarky way. I mean, I don't care as in it doesn't offend me. If you tell me I'm an asshole for owning the deck and there's no actual grounded reason for that, that might offend me.
Yeah.
When people say to me, "Oh, the world I know," yeah, and they say their feelings about it, and I just find it fascinating, because I'm like, look at how our relationships differ between those two things. Or like something that I definitely have found has really inspired my reading, and that I play with doing more, but I wouldn't say it's like a go-to. It doesn't come up a lot with clients other than one that I've worked with for a really long time, is that some people notice things in the card and they go very literal. And they're like, well, you were talking about, I don't know, blah, 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 I saw you through a window, and look, there's someone looking through a window. And I'm like, I love bringing attention to stuff that actually sometimes would have before gone straight over my head. And I think even that is, there are, again, non-traditional facets of that you could still bring to a traditional system, but it's just not a traditional part of that system, which then, like, hey, is it tradition or is it not? How much do we get to, and I would extend that to decks as well. How much does a deck stretch before it doesn't count as traditional? Because there's decks that I will, I don't mind other people disagreeing, but I will put my opinion in for a very specific reason, that I definitely think they're still tarot decks. Now, I don't own the Dreams of Gaia, but my friend does. I would like a copy eventually, but I would still argue that's a tarot deck, because to me, how is that not a tarot deck? I mean, I know there's a couple of extra cards, but the Marielle is, because a lot of people would say, well, the Marielle is definitely a tarot deck. It's not any more traditional, really. And the Lioness Oracle Tarot, I always bang on people. I'm like, don't let the name confuse you, because people are like, oh, it's an oracle. And I'm like, you can read it as one, but her name is Lioness Oracle. That's why it's in the title. I feel the tarot from it. And so I find that even in itself a really interesting, like, if it's 78 cards, so okay, we'll leave the Dreams of Gaia out in that instance, but because I think it's more than 78, I think it's got like 80 something. But, you know, what does and doesn't make it traditional? And I guess I just find that really, really curious. Like, I'd love to know what people think about that as well. So not just the structures, but what does or doesn't make a deck.
Yeah, that would be really interesting, because there are a few that, like, there's that old saying, right? All tarot is oracle, but not all oracle is tarot.
Yeah.
So, like, for me, what defines what is or isn't a tarot deck, for me, comes down to that 78 card structure. It can have extra cards, that's fine, but if it has at least the 78 card structure, that, because I read numerologically and elementally, there's a place for each of those.
Yeah.
So as long as it's got that, for me, it's a tarot. And it doesn't matter how far outside of the meanings it stretches. If it's got those 78 cards that align with the base idea of, like, you can change the Empress to be whatever you want, but if it's still serving that same purpose as the Empress does in that same way with that same number, then to me it's an Empress. But then you get those that, like, the worst is, I think, for me, when they say it's a tarot and it's clearly not. Don't call it a tarot if it's not a tarot. Tarot has a structure. It's the whole point. It is still an oracle, but it's a particular structure of oracle, in my opinion. So
yeah. And I think for me, it sometimes there's a little bit of visual layering on it as well. Because whilst I said I can work without the visual, which is fine, if someone's going to give me a visual and they give me something that's like, I don't know, maybe quite violent and aggressive looking for the Empress card, then I'm going to be like, unless it's like a horror tarot and all of the whole deck is thematically that way inclined, then I would be like, I feel like you're confused about what the Empress is. And so that's when it gets really interesting, because even though I'm not inherently traditional, we go back to that. There clearly is a structural facet that I adhere to,
right.
Because when someone puts something like that in a card, that's when I go, and I'll do it when I'm walking through decks, like, this card doesn't make sense for me in this context at all. I'm not feeling, I can layer it on, and then we revert to our foundational stuff, but that's not making sense for me. So it's, even that is interesting, and again, why I feel like it's hard to contextualize and pause in a moment to then be a good reflection of, because you'd literally have to show me all of the tarot cards forever for me to be able to say, this is inherently a Three of Wands for me and this is not.
Right. Yeah. It's so fascinating. We should definitely get into like talking about specific decks maybe that are non-traditional, and how, like, what makes them non-traditional versus traditional, and things of that nature.
Yeah.
Practices, things like that.
And if people can suggest things, ask things, we will look at sort of theming some of our conversations around those, so that they're less general, like the first two have been.
Kind of just here's what we're doing, like real broad strokes.
Welcome to us two hanging out and talking about traditional tarot. What do you want to hear? What are your focus points? What are the themes? What do you want to see? What are your thoughts? Because we could even do like a response thing to some thoughts as well, and not response like, we're not going to disagree with you, more than perhaps saying, oh, okay, that's not how we would do it, but that's really interesting because
we definitely want it to be a space to discuss the different facets of practicing non-traditional tarot, or working with non-traditional tarot, and at the same time talking about traditional tarot, because like we both agree that's important. It's there, it's the foundation. Like, we're not discounting that in any way, shape, or form, just because we're
not stuck in it.
We're not stuck in it. It's a baseline. It's not a box. Like, it's just going to be a metaphor. It's a line, not a box. Like, we're not in it. We're sitting on top of it, and we just go our own way.
We're not bouncing around with it. Just
it's my mind map thing, right? It's not an outline. It's a mind map.
Oh, I like it. I was thinking about it like, I don't know why this is such a boring metaphor, but apparently my brain's feeling boring. I was thinking about it like a piece of luggage. Like, I have lots of luggage, and they're all different themes, and traditional tarot structures are in one luggage, but I've also got like a bunch of others.
all your little accessory luggage. I got my makeup case.
It's just proof that I pack too much when I go on holiday. That's all that is. It's like, yes, I don't want to just go with 2 pairs of shoes in case I decide that I need these other.
Right? That's a whole nother discussion we can have. I need different decks for different moods, because reading tarot in a moody way, personifying tarot. I mean, I know Lisa and I've talked about personifying tarot too, but like, that is a non-traditional thing, to personify a deck.
Yeah.
That's a non-traditional thing. But having decks for different moods, that's a non-traditional thing. I need all of those things to make my well-rounded practice, because otherwise I feel like I would just be, it would be like wearing the same pair of shoes with every outfit. I'm sorry, not every outfit is meant to go with that one pair of shoes. It's just not how it works.
No.
I need lots of shoes.
Yeah, exactly. At the time, it's like, I crave different decks because it's an artistic experience for me. And I've always
Mhm.
said, like, I can never own as much artwork as I would want to in any other capacity, because
Yeah.
I would run out of wall space, and it would just be inherently expensive. Like,
Mhm.
buying actual art is very
Buying
expensive.
actual, yes, it's very expensive. Yeah.
The fact that we can get 78 of it in the varying price degrees that we can is amazing. But also,
Mhm.
I want to, as much as I'm intricative, sometimes I want to lean into the RWS more. Sometimes I
Mhm.
want to lean into numerology more. Sometimes I want something
Mhm.
really pippish, and sometimes I don't. And that is very much a show of how I want to lean into one facet of my structure more than others,
Mhm.
or how much I feel like engaging with one artwork or the spirit of a
Mhm.
deck more than another.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm big into. I don't think I personified decks for a long time, but I'm big into it, and I think that
Yeah.
it's like a co-creative thing as well, because
Mhm.
again, how you personify a deck might not be the way that I experience it, which is
Mhm.
why lots of discussions about the same deck doesn't bother me.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, like, I've had lots of people when I did my Diablo tarot, because that's a
Mm.
very unique kind of deck. It's got a very unique flair to it. And when I did my video, I don't know what that was, review, walkthrough, whatever. I was just talking about how I work with it, how I see it. I got so many interesting comments about how people see it in a completely different way. And that is fascinating, because when I'm looking at the Diablo tarot, I am layering in all kinds of stuff over the top of that. Like, I've got the tarot going, I've got the game stuff going, I've got the lore and the legend from playing the games for however many decades it's been,
Yeah.
and and my own personal associations, the fact that that's a game that I've played with my husband for multiple decades, like, all of that gets layered in. And that's a very me thing. It's
Yeah.
totally a me thing. So other people see something totally, like, other people, that's the ugliest deck and it's horrible and it's like every card in it is disgusting, and I'm like, I think it's beautiful. Are
Yeah.
there grotesque things in it? Absolutely. But I know the lore, and I have all of that back into me when I get it out. That's a beautiful deck. I love it. It's like one of my favorites.
Mm.
But that's very, it's that's through my own personal lens, me layering all that over the top of what is essentially a 78 card tarot deck.
Yeah. And exactly, because it's funny, it's so huge, so I've held
It's
off.
so huge.
I
Yeah. I forgive it, but it's one of the few that I make an exception for.
Yeah. I haven't played Diablo, although I have been a gamer over the years, but I never played
Mhm.
Diablo, and I nearly got it because it's very much my artistic taste. I would have
Mhm.
zero lore, and I would definitely probably be reading different. I would be giving the
Mhm.
characters based on my brain, not based
Mhm.
on who they were. So we'd have a very
Right.
different experience. But same as you, I think I like grotesque artwork, and I'm often
Mhm.
saying to people, it makes me happy. So
Yeah.
what is it? Someone's trash is another person's
Trash is another
treasure.
person's treasure. Absolutely. Yeah.
So
Because
yeah,
a lot of my collection isn't for everybody. Like, I have a lot of, like, gamer inspired decks, or decks that I have related to games that other people are like, I don't see that.
yeah,
Well, that's cool. Like, you don't have to. That's great. I'm glad you see what you see in it, and I see what I see in it, and we can have a conversation about this deck from these two different facets, and hopefully we both learn something through the process of it, which is amazing.
yeah. And it's a relationship. So the fact of the
Mhm.
matter is that both are true. And you
Mhm.
can argue, if you really want to get philosophical, all of it's true and none of it's true. So
Right. Absolutely. It's all tarot and none of it's tarot. So we're going to be on your channel next time, correct?
yeah,
Okay. And then if anybody has questions, topics that they'd like to get into, definitely let us know in the comments. If y'all haven't subscribed to Tegan, links will be below. So go check it out. Tegan also has a Patreon, which is amazing. I'm in that as well, with all kinds of stuff. You have the animal gnosis and the coven and like all kinds of stuff that I'm terrible at participating in, but I read it all.
I mean, I
Yeah.
just think that that's the way that people function, right? Like, I imagine that you get really good group engagement in your membership, and I think you're very good at inspiring people to come together at one time and create something together as well. But I imagine you've still got a lot more people in the membership than who necessarily are seen in participation, and I feel like that's normal for online now. There's a lot more
Yeah.
inclusion of stuff without participation.
Yeah.
I'm all for participation and it's fun.
Absolutely.
Also, as creators, I think that we both know that it's really hard to be here, there, and everywhere in everyone's stuff, other than to ingest it sometimes, because we don't stop.
We don't stop.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know where the time goes. I could do less things, but that's not going to happen. So,
No, no, let's not.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming and hanging out with me. I'm going to go hang out on your channel next time, and we'll keep an eye out for comments and questions. So we'll see everybody else again soon.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.